ORDA Science Webinar, Edge Topic, Long-Term Impacts of an Oil Spill on Freshwater Turtles on August 16, 2022 at 18:02 Universal Time by Josh Otten, University of Toledo. Recorded and organized by Samantha Foster in Microsoft Teams. Slide includes the USGS Science for a Changing World logo. Contact Samantha Forster to be added to the distribution list at samantha_foster@ios.doi.gov. The presentation slides and recording can be found at www.usgs.gov/centers/natural-resources-damage-assessment-and-restoration-NRDA. Joe Ellen speaking.
Items before we get started, you'll see on the screen that we have some upcoming webinars that may be of interest to you. In September, we're going to be talking about climate change planning as it relates to tribal restoration. And then in October, for the DOI National Workshop, which will be virtual, we are going to have a series of 4 talks on expanding your science toolbox. So some technologies that maybe you haven't used on your cases. And then in November, we're going to look at prescribed fire and wildfire and what that means for restoration. As always, you can sign up for the distribution list if you were forwarded this announcement. And then if you have a topic idea, please send it to myself or drop it in the chat. And actually, today's speaker came from a recommendation from Lisa Williams from Fish and Wildlife Service. So I want to thank Lisa for that. Not sure if she's on today.
The findings and conclusions in the webinar are those of the presenters and do not necessarily represent the views of DOI's NRDA program, the department including the trustee bureaus, or the United States. Although some of the presenters may be employees of government agencies, the ideas described herein do not reflect the policies of those agencies, and no official endorsement should be inferred on NRDA.
But today we have the pleasure of having Josh Otten, who is a Ph.D. student at the University of Toledo, and Josh is going to be talking about long-term impacts of water oil spill on aquatic turtles. So I'm going to do Josh's bio and then hand it over. So I'm really excited about this, Josh, because I was thinking we haven't had a turtle talk. We've had mussel talks and other aquatic critters, so it's nice to get our turtle friends in here. So Josh grew up in Iowa, where he attended Iowa State University for his undergrad, discovering his love of turtles during this time. Josh worked for the Iowa Department of Natural Resources for 3 years as part of their multi-species monitoring project. In 2010, Josh started working for an environmental consultant firm, where his first big project was conducting wildlife rescue as part of the Kalamazoo River oil spill, and he spent nearly 2 years in this area. While working, he attended the University of Northern Iowa for his master's project on wood turtles, and was fortunate to go from there to the University of Toledo for his Ph.D., where he could follow up nearly 10 years later to answer important ecological questions regarding the population of turtles affected by the Kalamazoo River oil spill. And Josh's fun fact, I think it's a little scary, but Josh has begun combining his love of baking with taxidermy to create some fantastic cakes. So I don't know if I'd want to try it, but I am intrigued, Josh. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing. I will do a quick sound check for you once you get your slide up, and then I will go off camera and onto mute and hand it over to you.
Joe Ellen, a long, straight-haired woman wearing glasses and a patterned blouse. Her background displays print of a landscape. Josh has medium brown combed-over hair with a short beard, wearing a blue plaid button-up short. His background is blurred.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay then?
I can hear you.
Okay, I'm going to shut off the camera to save a little bandwidth and then start sharing. Let's see. Can you see it okay then?
Yeah, it doesn't. Yes, now it's in presentation mode. It looks great to go.
Okay, perfect. Okay. Well, thank you for having me here to talk to you today about some of the research that I've been conducting as a PhD student at the University of Toledo, specifically looking at the long-term impacts of freshwater oil spill on turtles. So for those that don't know, the Kalamazoo River oil spill occurred in 2010, July 2010. It kind of got overshadowed because of all that was occurring with BP in the Gulf. But it was one of the largest freshwater oil spills to occur in the United States, where it spilled nearly 1 million gallons of the diluted bitumen oil that ends up impacting about 56 kilometers of the Kalamazoo River. And this spill was pretty typical of other spills where you get that oil sheen across the water. It did occur at the time when the river was at like the 100-year flood stage. So you also get a lot of the banks, the vegetation, the woody debris that's being oiled as well. And so a large effort went into the cleanup, the removing of the oil, the removing of the woody debris of all the oiled vegetation. But what I really wanted to focus the talk today on was the wildlife component of it. And so when you think of most oil spills and wildlife, you think of the birds. And yes, there was a number of birds that had been oiled, but what ends up happening is you typically need to capture those birds fairly quickly, otherwise they perish. And I was in the fortunate position to work for a consulting company that we got the call almost immediately to come over and help with the wildlife cleanup. And as a turtle guy, we really started to focus our efforts on capturing turtles, because we found that there was a large number of turtles in the Kalamazoo River, a large number of turtles that got oiled, and these turtles could live in that environment with that oil for weeks to months at a time. And so that allowed us to spend nearly 2 years going out there surveying and collecting as many turtles as possible, and then getting that oil off of them. And so it took a large effort. Like I say, it was about 15 months that we had spent capturing as many turtles as possible, sometimes hundreds a day. And so that required a large number of volunteers that would come in and systematically clean that oil off the turtles. And so they would sit and scrub meticulously with the Dawn dish soap, flush out their system with the mayonnaise. And then as we're progressing, nothing like this had really occurred before with this number of turtles. And so we had to come up with ways to be able to keep all the animals either when they were coming in oiled or after they had been cleaned, making sure they were given the proper treatment. So we had a number of vet staff there that was giving treatments and eventually clearing the turtles to be released back out into the wild.
Photos of rows of clear shelves with plastic containers and lights, oiled birds and turtles, and groups of volunteers cleaning the animals by hand at a table.
So as part of this, like I say, we had done work up pretty extensively while cleanup was going on through 2011. Enbridge, the oil company that was involved, they had reported this number here in that we had collected over 5,100 turtles and had released, over 97% of those were released back out in the wild. But as a turtle guy, as a biologist, there was a number of things that kind of stuck out with me with this number, is that we were only dealing with these turtles in the short term, sometimes only a few days at a time, sometimes a few weeks, and then we're releasing them back out in the wild. And we don't really know what they're doing after the fact. Like, yes, in the short term here, in this immediate, it was a very successful venture, but turtles can live to be 60, 70 years in the wild, and we didn't really know what the oil does to the individual turtles or to the environment that we were putting them back into. And so I had a couple of big questions that sort of stuck with me, and then luckily I had the opportunity to come back and work on a PhD through the University of Toledo, where I could really look at some of these questions that I wanted to kind of answer.
Major questions were: is translocation a viable mitigation strategy for emergency response in turtles? Does rehabilitation increase survival in turtles? Has the population, demographics, and size of turtles changed since the oil spill?
And that was looking at this translocation. So when we were cleaning the turtles and releasing them, a lot of times there was too much oil still in the river, and instead of keeping them in captivity any longer, we thought it was going to be more beneficial to release them back out into similar habitat that was connected. And so I wondered if that mitigation strategy, was a successful venture, if somebody could do that down the road, kind of replicate what we had done, because nobody had done anything like that before. And then in addition, a large amount of effort, money, time went into the rehabilitation process. And so I wondered, is it even worth it? Did going through rehab help these turtles increase their survival or anything like that? So I wanted to look at that as well. And then finally, the big one is, coming back 8 to 10 years later, we had spent so much time and effort capturing so many turtles. I wondered if I could kind of replicate that study and see if there was much change to the population, to the demographics, and the sizes of the turtles that we captured, 10 years after that spill. So on the previous slide, you saw the turtle species that we caught the most of was the northern map turtles. I wanted to focus my study on this. There was a lot of other species that were caught there, but these I thought would make the most interesting study species because we had captured so many, for one. Two, they're very susceptible to oiling because they're avid baskers. They're coming in and out of the water daily. And so because of that, they're picking up oil from the water column, from the vegetation, and so forth. Also, they're highly aquatic. They're basically only leaving the water to bask unless the females are leaving to nest once a year. The other thing that's interesting with the northern map turtles is they're sexually dimorphic. So you do have this adult female on the left, is about 5 times the size of our adult males on the right. And so because of that, you're going to have differences in diet, differences in behavior. And so I wanted to look at some of those as well in terms of the population and survival.
The topographical map highlights areas south of the Great Lakes in the United States.
So the first piece of this study was dealing with this translocation, this emergency mitigation strategy that we had, and see, is this even a viable strategy? Is it something that somebody else could use down the road? And then with that, this kind of ties into turtles' homing ability. So a lot of studies out there looking at terrestrial species, box turtles, gopher tortoises, and you always hear that thing, don't move a turtle when it's crossing the road, don't move it to a new location when it's crossing the road because it has a sense of home. And these studies show that these turtles will wander if you move them, or sometimes they'll go back to that same location they were found. So I was curious if aquatic species actually exhibit this as well. Will they come back to that home range once they're moved? So in order to do this, I had to look at the data from 2010 in which figure out which turtles had been translocated. And to do that, in 2018-19, I conducted a pretty typical home range study, going out there, tracking our turtles a couple times a week, figuring out about how much habitat they're occupying in the river. And so through that, I find that our males are occupying about a 2.4 kilometer stretch of river. Our females are occupying about a 4.6 kilometer stretch of the river. And so I used those numbers to determine whether or not a turtle had been translocated. So if it had been released further than that distance, then I consider that a translocated individual and use that for analysis. And so I end up and have a sample size of nearly 700 turtles that we had translocated to various locations. And so what I wanted to do was look at some of the locations and the distances to analyze this homing ability.
Map of the Kalamazoo River watershed in Michigan from Kalamazoo to Marshall, identifying spill origins, translocation sites, and study sites from 2018 to 2020.
And so this is a map showing some of the translocation locations that we had with these turtles. You can see early on we were releasing them downstream, so I called this area one study site, the downstream locations. We also get the upstream locations, and then so then you get some of these upstream locations, and then there's also these locations within the tributaries. And then eventually the river had been clean enough that we could release the turtles back as close to where they came from. And so when we're talking about movement and we're talking about homing ability, one thing to think about is barriers. And there's a lot of barriers on the Kalamazoo River. On the lower stretch here, you have this large hydroelectric dam. There's a number of these 3 to 4 meter tall spillways, and then through the city of Battle Creek here, you got like a 1.5 kilometer long concrete channel. So in order to figure out which turtles had been translocated, I had to get out there and capture turtles in subsequent years. When we had originally marked these turtles, we were only doing those individuals that were 100 grams and larger, which ends up being the adult males, adult females, and subadult females. And we're marking them with a pit tag, so that little chip that you put in a dog or cat. When you're resurveying an area, you can't tell if a turtle had been translocated or not when you're paddling down the river. So we just need to capture as many possible turtles as we can, hoping to get some that had been translocated. And so in order to do that, we're out there daily just capturing turtles. And so you can see over the course of the study, we had the 2010, 2011, that was when the cleanup was going on, about 5,000 captures. 2013, I don't really talk about, but there was a little bit of work that happened, and we had some translocated individuals caught then that we didn't catch in any other year. And then 18, 19, 20, that was the years that I was out there doing work for my dissertation.
Methods of capture include traps, hand netting, snorkeling, sexed, measured, and marked. North Map Turtle Capture Table shows new captures from 2010 to 2020 totaling 5,711. Recapture totals 4,460.
So this is a little video. Let's see if I can get it to play.
A snorkeler goes under a tree in the water where multiple turtles are clustered underneath.
There it goes. So this video shows one of the methods of capturing turtles. This is kind of the snorkeling method. Map turtles are notoriously difficult to capture. They don't really go in traps like other species of turtles, and they're very flighty. So when you're going down with a boat, you're 100 meters away, and those things will jump in the water. But what we find is they like to hide in these dark areas. So when the water is clear enough and low enough, you can snorkel down and capture the turtles that way. And so with the data analysis, I was looking at just those recaptures. And like I say, I used the stream home range as that metric to know whether or not a turtle had been translocated by calculating that original capture location and where it had been released while following entirely within the channel. And then I also wanted to calculate that max distance from release. Thinking kind of bigger picture, nothing like this has been done, and I thought it would be important to know like how far these turtles can actually move given the opportunity. So I used that max distance from the release location to figure that out. And then the other one was looking at that minimum distance from the original capture. So here I'm trying to figure out if a turtle's found its way back home. So I use that 2.4 kilometer stream home range and that 4.6 for the females. And if that minimum distance fell within that, then I said that that individual had successfully homed. And then I used those locations, the upstream, downstream tributaries, the distance that it was released, and the sex to look at the recapture and evaluate the recapture and homing probabilities. So what that looks like here with the recaptures, we were very successful at recapturing turtles. We caught nearly a third of those that had been translocated, which when you think about detectability of turtles, it's quite low. Out of like those 10,000 captures, I think the majority we had only caught one time over the 300 some days that we were out there surveying. There was quite a few that we catch twice and then some that we catch a lot. But because that detectability is low, and then you have these random 700 turtles that had been released to other locations, being able to recapture about a third of those was quite successful in my mind. And we find that there's no difference in the proportion of sex that were recaptured. We were recapturing females just as much as males. But what you end up seeing is the interaction between translocation distance and sex and site explain that recapture probability the best. So I've broken it down into 3 different locations, the downstream, upstream, tributary, and then plotted along the one here. Those are turtles that we had successfully recaptured. On the 0 are those that we did not. And you can see as that translocation distance increases, that the probability that you're going to recapture that turtle ends up decreasing. And then for the tributary, that's going to be a lot less probability of recapture than those downstream turtles. For travel distance, we find that females do move significantly further than males. This was to be expected because of the size, thinking about swimming ability. And also females typically, with map turtles, they have a really high degree of site fidelity to nest locations. So the thought was they'd want to come back and nest in those spots year after year. But that's not to say that the males can't travel quite a distance. We had quite a few that moved over 30, 40 kilometers. And then we got those 2 females that traveled some substantial distance, 70 kilometers upriver against the flow of the river. So when you're looking at the homing ability, here I had just took those individuals that were translocated that we recaptured and looked at how many of those had successfully found their way home. And so we have nearly 50% of those, quite a substantial number, pretty interesting to me. But what you do see is that the females are homing more often than the males. But again, we did have 56 of our males return within that 2.4 kilometer stretch of river. And this was pretty surprising to me, thinking when we were releasing these animals, we're releasing them in locations that there's known females, that there's food sources, that there's basking. So why would the males want to waste any energy? But they seem to want to come back to home just as much as the females did. And so with this homing ability, we see that translocation, distance, and sex explains that probability the best. And so that's what this is showing you here, is successfully homing now on the one axis, and those that we had recaptured that didn't on the zero. And so you can see as you get to those further translocation distances, the females have a higher probability of finding their way back home. And it's pretty substantial to see that, for a 50-50 shot of your females, you're talking 30 kilometers away. The males, it's about 18, 17 kilometers at 50%.
The map highlights a path distance from Battle Creek down to the Kalamazoo River.
So it's one thing to show numbers, but I wanted to kind of show a little bit of these maps to give you a sense of how interesting these movements are. This is a female that we had originally captured on the Kalamazoo here. She was released on a tributary about 23 kilometers away. This turtle follows the flow of the river down, and she gets to where the creek here drains into the Kalamazoo River. And instead of continuing with the flow, she ends up changing directions here, turning about 90 degrees. She goes through this concrete channel and then somehow figures out a way up and around this 4-meter tall spillway. And then we eventually recapture her about 4 or 5 times, the closest being within 500 meters of that original capture location. Another real interesting one here is this female. We caught her way up here on the Kalamazoo. She was 3 years of age, released her way down below the city of Kalamazoo, and she continues upriver for 67, almost 68 kilometers. She's going against the flow. She gets around this giant hydroelectric dam. She also goes through the concrete channel. She also figures out a way around that spillway, and we recapture that female only one time in 2019, 200 meters away from that original capture location.
Over 1/3 translocated turtles recapped. They travel around barriers, and furthest homing is 67.7 kilometers.
So we find that the mitigation within connected habitat allows the return of these turtles, that it's a successful mitigation measure if you want them to come back from where they had originally come from. It is very density dependent. You get those further distances, less likelihood they're going to make their way back. But we do see that both males and females are exhibiting this homing ability when released to these unfamiliar locations. And not only are both sexes doing it, but what is really interesting is these young turtles, this 3-year-old female who exhibited this homing ability. And we had a couple of the younger males also do that as well. So that leads into this next piece, looking at the survival rates. So one of the first things that I really wanted to do was look at that observed direct mortality of northern map turtles as a result of the spill. Enbridge did report that one figure, but I wanted to look at specific species and look at that 2010 time period and say exactly, put in writing, put in the literature, how many of those turtles died as a result of that oil spill. Because as you're doing some of these damage assessments, there's really not a lot out there with that. So I thought it was an important piece to have. And then with that, I wanted to look at the rehabilitation process. Is it going to increase the survival at all? Is this even a worthwhile venture kind of going forward if another spill like this, or when another spill like this happens?
Conservation implications. Why do we care? Level of effort and money spent on rehabilitation projects. Mixed results with birds and mammals. Nothing to this extent with reptiles. And can't predict spills or lack of data.
So for this, instead of focusing on the whole stretch of river, I just looked at the upper stretch. It's about a 20 kilometer. This was the area that had most of the oil. We caught a lot more turtles, a lot more oil turtles. There was a nice break right at that spillway in the city of Battle Creek. And so for this, I wanted to compare the 3 different types of rehabilitation that the turtles have undergone. So first, you have these non-rehab turtles. These are ones that we catch out there where there had been oiled, but the turtles either had no oil on them or they had very little oil that you could just clean off with a finger or a brush real quick. And then we did that, marked them, released them at that point of capture. And then you get this next subset that goes through this rehabilitation process. So these, I included turtles that spent at least one night in the rehab facility and had been released in 2010 and had been released within a kilometer of that original capture location. And so these turtles then had gone through the cleaning process. A vet had looked at them. A vet had cleared them for release before we had released them back out. And then finally, there was one other set, this overwinter group. Now, these were turtles, as we get later in the season, the turtles start to go into hibernation. We thought it would be better to keep the turtles over winter because some still needed treatment and we were still catching quite a few. And we didn't know where they were hibernating and if they could get it back to hibernation. So we decided it would be safer to keep them over the winter, keep them at a pretty constant temperature, and then be able to monitor their health, feed them. And then we had vets on staff that were looking after the turtles day in and day out. And then eventually these turtles were released then in May of 2011.
Large metal cylindrical tanks with whites and branches across the top.
So for the analysis, I only wanted to focus on sexable turtles. These are going to be typically turtles that have a shell length of 5 centimeters or greater. For mortality, I wanted to focus on those that were brought in dead, those that died in care in 2010, or those that we had to actually permanently transfer to rehabbers because they had an injury that they couldn't be released back out into the wild. And for survival then, I removed the translocated individuals and just looked at the others that were released back near where they were originally captured, and used the Cormack-Jolly-Sieber method using mark-recapture to calculate monthly survival. Now, typically people do annual, you have 6-7 years of data, but I really wanted to focus on monthly because there was so much work that was still going on within the river at the time that I thought it would be a better, more accurate estimate of kind of the survival of these individuals. And so I broke it into 2 different study periods where I looked at the monthly survival in that 1 to 14 months post-spill, and then also 8 to 11 years post-spill. And then compared the treatment types and the sex to look at modeling the survival. And so you can see we had quite a few non-rehab turtles, nearly 600. We had about 320 of the rehab and nearly 300 of the overwintered. And then, we recaught a fair number of each of those then in 2018 through 20.
Table of northern map turtle captures by treatment type. Total from 2010 to 2011 is 2,414. Females non-rehab is 412. Rehab is 128. Overwintered is 164. Males non-rehab are 147. Rehab is 194. Overwintered is 121. Totals from 2018 to 2021 is 784. Females non-rehabed is 128. Rehabed is 32. Overwintered is 58. Males non-rehabed is 15, rehabed is 22, and overwintered is 32.
For mortality rates, we ended up and had 67 mortality events. 2 that died coming in, 50 in care, 15 that were transferred. All but one of those had visible oiling. The one that didn't was one that may have been run over by a boat as a result of cleanup. But the thing to note here is that we do see a higher rate in females. And, earlier that Enbridge thing, the Enbridge number was 97% And here you can see we had a mortality rate of 7.6 in 2010, which with a turtle population that typically has upwards well over 90% annual survival, having a sort of a mass mortality of nearly 8% of the reproducing females in the population can potentially have detrimental effects down the road, especially with an individual that lives 50, 60 years and takes 20 years of reproducing to eventually replace her in the population. The big thing to note here, though, is these animals that were under supervision, under care, died an average of almost 60 days after their capture. Again, these are turtles that are under constant care, constant vet supervision, given anything and everything they need, but they still end up dying 60 days. That shows that there's some sort of delayed mortality that might be occurring in some of these turtles. For the survival rates, what we end up finding is that rehab explains the 1 to 14 months post-spill the best, that our estimated monthly survival with the overwinter turtles is going to be highest. It's sitting around 97, 98%. Those that went through any time in the rehab had the next highest, around 92%. And those non-rehab turtles now are right around 82, 83%. And then when you look at that 8 to 11 years post-spill, things kind of return much more normal, where our monthly survival now, our females, is explained best by sex, with females having that higher monthly survival rate, right around 99, and our males right around about 97. And so you can see those overwinter turtles had the most similar monthly survival to those 8 to 11 years post-spill. And then as you look at other studies, especially into sexually dimorphic turtle species, you find that females have the higher survival, typically, less predators because of their size. So we find that, functional mortality occurred in nearly 6% of those individuals in 2010. Again, you got to take into account that we also translocated 683. But what we do end up showing is that rehab is successful in turtles, that we can increase that monthly survival rate if they go through any time in the rehab facility, and the longer that they're spent in that rehab center and under supervision, the higher likelihood they are of having higher survival rate.
No difference in rehab survival 8 to 11 years later.
So that leads to the last piece here, kind of the big one, looking at the population and seeing if it's changed over time. So I had mentioned it takes a little bit of time for mortality to occur with some of these turtles that get oiled, and so much effort had been spent out there surveying for turtles in 2010, 2011, that we had a large data set to work with. And so I wanted to replicate that kind of going forward in 19 and 20 to see, is there a change in the estimated number of population, the size of the turtles, and the overall kind of demographics.
Conservation implications. Why do we care? Should people rescue oiled wildlife? Money better spent somewhere else. Inform future events. Target specific rescue efforts, such as age groups and sexes.
So this, again, I focused on just that upper stretch of the river, less to worry about there, and a lot more capture, less distance to have to cover, and more captures that occurred there. For these, again, our methods involve capture, trying to get as many captures as possible that increases how, like your mark-recapture, and give you better population estimates. And so you can see a lot of effort was spent in capturing. So I looked at just the number of days people were out there surveying, and then I also looked at the number of boat days. So there's some days that there'd be 3 boats running up and down the river in that one particular stretch, surveying over and over for turtles, versus, say, 2020, when it was just me out there surveying. But then I looked at the catch per unit effort to show that, even though it was just me in 2020, I'm still catching a lot of turtles. That catch per unit effort's quite high, so that, the comparisons between years is still going to be valid.
He walked on the sand next to a kayak and picked up a turtle buried under the sand.
And then here's a little video showing how successful I got at catching turtles. I didn't have to see them basking on the logs. I could take a break on the little sandbar like this and be able to figure out where those turtles are and capture them with little to no sign. And so unfortunately, I didn't do anything with the soft shell turtles, but I did end up catching a lot of those, which is what that turtle is. So for the analysis, again, I only looked at the sexable turtles, typically over that 5 centimeter shell length. I excluded all the 2010 translocations because when you're talking about removing 700, you're going to have a big population decline between 2010 and 2011. And used the Schnabel method to estimate the population size, but this time looking at weekly mark recapture. So because we were going out there so often in 2010, I looked at weekly instead of daily, because then in 2020, I was out there at least once a week surveying, and used only 1 capture of an individual per week. And then for the body size distribution, I only used the first capture of an individual per year with that shell measurement, and used that to create these mean SCLs and density plots. So for our population size, this is what I estimated. I broke it into females and males. And so you can see 2010 here, we had about 850 or so estimated females. The males was sitting around 450 But the big thing to note then is when you get to 2011, nearly a 30% decrease in our estimated number of males, and our females seem to stay put, which in 2011, I felt like we had caught like a ton of turtles, a ton of individuals, and we did, but it seemed to be a lot more of the females, and the males, we were recapturing the same males over and over and over again. Then the thing to note is when we get to this next line here is there's this 8-year gap between 2011 and 2019 when I was back surveying. But what you can see now is that those females dropped by nearly 40%, and our males are starting to increase. And the females is one of those, again, when we were out there surveying, felt like you caught a lot of females. But when you start looking at the data, it's the same female that you're catching over and over and over again. And then the males, what was interesting with this is that you'd see a lot of younger males, and so you're catching a lot more males in previous years, but then it seemed to be a lot of those younger ones. And then when you compare that to 2019 to 2020, there's not really any difference between the 2 years of survey here. Again, there's going to be wider confidence intervals. It's just me out there surveying at that point, but those overlap so that there really wasn't a significant difference between the population there. So then trying to figure out kind of what's going on with this, I wanted to look at the shell size, the body size. The shell size is kind of an accurate way to look at age. With turtles, you can typically age them fairly well up till about 8, but there's a lot of variability. You're looking at the rings, counting rings, and sometimes they get more growth rings in a year. Some species, they get only 1 growth ring every 3 years. So I thought using body size is going to be a better indicator of what's going on with that population. So first, for the males here, you can see not a lot of change between 2010 and 11, and then 2019, you get a significant decrease. This stems from catching a lot of those younger males and hardly any of those older males. And so this 9-centimeter shell length, that's typically representative of turtles that are about 4 to 5 years just reaching sexual maturity. And so then you can see then there's another significant increase into the next year. And for those subadult, those early adult turtles that are about 9 centimeters, in 1 year time, they typically grow about a ½ centimeter. So all those 4- and 5-year-old turtles that we were catching in 2019, we were catching them the next year as 5- and 6-year-old turtles. As far as density plots go, this kind of gives you a better indication of what I was talking about. 2010 and 11 here, you can see we were catching a lot of big old males, but then comparing that to 2019-20, a lot fewer of those older males. And we specifically were looking for them and trying to catch them, and there just wasn't very many out there. And then looking at the flip side of this, you can see in 2019-2020, we're catching a lot of those 4- to 5-year-old turtles that represents in this size class where there really wasn't nearly as many in 2010 and 2011. Females followed a similar trend, not much change between 2010 and 11, but then you get that significant decrease in size. Again, this is representative of catching a lot more of the really young females, those 4- and 5-year-old females. And then it's pretty typical in turtle populations. You don't see a lot of change from 1 year to the next because they are slow growing. And that's then what happens between 2019 and 20. You don't have any change at all. And so that looks like this with the females. You can see every year we caught similar size of those older adult females. That adult female range hits right around this 18 or so. But the interesting thing to note here is this area here. This represents about 8 to 12-year-old turtles, and so you can see there's a dip in the 2019 and 2020 individuals where these would have been turtles that were either born when the spill occurred or were 1, 2, 3 years old. These smaller individuals that, maybe a sign that the oil had done something more to those younger turtles that we just didn't pick up on. And then on the flip side, kind of like the males here, you see we're catching a lot more of the younger females now than we did in 2010 and 2011. So I mentioned size and eliminating these kind of smaller individuals that, I didn't look at it, the population. But I wanted to touch on these because I think this is an important point as well. So map turtles generally are born, they're about 2.5 to 3 centimeter size, shell size. And so this less than 5 centimeter represent turtles that are less than a year old. This 5 to 6 represents turtles that are about 1 to 2 years of age. And so you can see in 2010, we caught nearly none. And I remember every time we would catch some of these little hatchlings, it was always a big deal because hatchling turtles were cute, and it's kind of a big deal when one came in. And then you look at in subsequent years. Granted, in 2019 and 18, we had done a lot of nest protection, so that's why you probably get this big bump in the number of young turtles that we're catching. But in 2011 and 2020, I think these are probably much more normal years where you do have quite a few of those young turtles out there that we just didn't see in 2010, because they do end up hiding in vegetation like this right along the banks where a lot of that work had gone on, that was collecting all the oil vegetation, digging up the banks. You had boats going back and forth, and these things can't swim very well, and they'd be easily missed and probably picked up in a lot of that oil vegetation. So we end up finding that there is a decline in the estimated population. The males occurs between 2010 and 11, and the females took a little bit longer, but we did see that decline between 2011 and 2019. And this also goes along with there's a change in the demographics where you're seeing a lot more of the younger, smaller males now than you did before. Where in 2010 we had a lot of older males that were in that population. We just don't have them. And then we see fewer of those 8 to 12-year-old females. The 8 to 12-year-old males I didn't mention because they're a lot harder to identify that age class, because it kind of jumbles in with a lot of the older males, and they don't grow nearly as much, and so it's hard to kind of tease those out. And the big thing too is that there was very, very, very few young turtles that were captured in 2010. With that, there's a lot of people to thank, ton of people that worked in 2010, 11, funding sources for the dissertation work that I had done.
Logos include Kalamazoo River Trustees, University of Toledo, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Natural Resources, Michigan, and Enbridge. Thanks to Margaret Haywood, Dissertation Committee, Rhett Snyder, Strebe Labs, 2018 to 2019 Field Techs, 2019 to 2020 Undergrad Researchers, Don Becker, Luke Hodges, Bob Doherty, Dr. Chris Tabaka, 2010 to 2011 Stantic Coworkers. Funding by Enbridge, Kalamazoo River Natural Resource Trustee Council, USFWS, U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, Michigan DEQ, DNR, and DAG, NOAA, Nottawa Sepi Huron Band of the Potawatomi, Match E.B. Nash, Shewish Band of Potawatomi.
And then I'll leave you with this image of me in my office and take any questions.
He is sitting in a kayak holding a turtle in one hand with a laptop on his lap as he is floating on the water. Joe Ellen speaking.
Well, thank you, Josh. I already see a hand. Jeremy, if you want to come off mute and ask your question.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I was curious. It's a great presentation and very interesting. We're working on an oil spill right now that's going through a cleanup phase, and we're looking at actually developing our input into remediation plans in the next couple of weeks. And so it's really timely for us to have this information. And I'm curious, did you look at any type of water quality standards or indicators or criteria as far as your research that had impacts on turtle populations?
Joshua speaking.
I did not. I know there was a lot of water quality stuff that had taken place, in 2010, 11, and kind of beyond. But I didn't look at any of that. And I think maybe Clark or Lisa might be able to answer or provide information regarding that.
Lisa speaking.
Yeah, we did. There was a lot of water sampling and sediment sampling done in 2010, both by the response and by the NRDA. The NRDA had a longer analyte list, looking at alkylated pHs and things like that. And at the time, and then there was also sediment taken into the lab and with done, benthic invertebrate toxicity testing. And there was not a strong signal, not a strong indication that there were constituents of the oil that were causing direct acute mortality. There was initial concerns about DO levels in the water, during the course of the initial phase of the spill when the oil was covering the river from bank to bank, and DO levels did drop. So, but they did not drop low enough to cause a fish kill. They were getting close to DO concentrations of concern, but did not go below that threshold, despite it being the end of July and a fairly warm time period. The river was in, I think, as Josh mentioned, the river was in flood stage when the spill happened, and was over bank and high flow, and perhaps a little bit cooler than it might normally be at the end of July. But we did not see direct water quality parameters or oil constituents causing acute mortality in 2010.
Jeremy speaking.
Okay, well, thank you. Thanks for the information. Because yes, one of the things we're looking for, and this is going to help us, is looking at how to the longer term impacts, and that's what we're wanting to make sure is included in these plans before they're finalized. So again, just want to thank you for the information. It's a great presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's a bunch of really tough calls in that. You know, Josh mentioned sort of the mechanical impacts of removing oil vegetation probably causing a loss of turtles. But if that hadn't been done, there would have been residual oil in the system much longer, continuing to re-release into the water column and getting downstream even farther than it did. And then when shoreline bank vegetation and large woody debris were removed, we started to have erosion issues. So it was a series of sort of net environmental benefit trade-offs that were having to be decided specific to that river.
Joe Ellen speaking.
All right, looks like Elizabeth, your hand is up next.
Yeah, I'm Betsy Nightingale. I'm an OSC with US EPA who works in Michigan and did work on this spill. I don't see a lot of my coworkers, with the EPA on this call, but, just on behalf of my office and EPA, thank you so much for all the work that you did to work with the wildlife response. I had a couple questions. I was just curious to learn a little bit more about the translocation. Did the turtles have to be moved pretty far away because the more upstream areas weren't ready for them to be reintroduced to? And then I was also hoping that you would speak to a few of those conservation questions that you had about, whether you do think it's worth spending the money on the rehab and some of those other questions that you had. So thank you. Thank you again. We appreciate it so much.
Joshua speaking.
Oh yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. Translocation. So that was a tricky one where, at first you're bringing in a couple turtles, then it's a couple dozen turtles, which you can handle, and then all of a sudden a couple dozen turtles goes to 100 turtles and 100 turtles a day. And so when you're dealing with 700 turtles in a facility, it's quite overwhelming. Some of them didn't have nearly as much oil as others, and so they were quickly cleaned and seemed fine to be released. But that was early days of the spill, where there was still so much oil that was in the river, and there was so much work that was going on, that we thought it would be safer to get them out there into the wild, because there's been stuff with translocations, and you look at sliders and pets being released and they can survive. So the thought was to try to find places that were close to where the spill occurred within that same watershed, so that there's that potential they could come back, but there's that potential they might stay, and we wanted to make sure to find locations that had turtles, had other turtles, and had woody debris and everything else that they would need.
Lisa speaking.
Yeah, and Josh, before you go on to the second part, Betsy, good to see that you were able to join. Yeah, we had a tremendous excellent working relationship between EPA and the natural resource agencies on this spill. I think it was just, we were all kind of learning as we went, and that decision on where to release the turtles that were ready to go out in the field was something that DNR, Fish and Wildlife Service, and Enbridge's contractors, like Josh was at the time, had almost daily meetings on, trying to find good places for the turtles as close as they could be. And this was a diluted bitumen spill, so the oil was separating as it was weathering, and there was an entire prong of the cleanup, which Betsy knows, that dealt with submerged oil and oil that was becoming associated with the sediments. And in 2011, there was a lot of sediment agitation techniques used to try and recover oil by getting it to float to the surface. Then there were sediment traps, and eventually there was excavation in this river. So it was a vigorous cleanup that occurred during not just 2010, but 2011 and on for a couple of years after that to deal with the submerged oil, because this was a diluted bitumen spill.
And then in terms of the talking about survival, whether rehab's necessary or should be done, you know, there is a lot of debate, like, oh, the amount of effort, the amount of money could be spent elsewhere, where, you know, these animals are probably in trouble anyways. But as you do it, obviously you feel good cleaning the oil off and releasing them, and you know, you felt like you're doing the right thing. And then as I started back in 2018 and started capturing some of those turtles with chips and seeing that they were still out there, then you're like, okay, I see that what had happened was successful. And then when I start looking at the capture records and seeing, oh, this was a turtle that had gone through the rehabilitation facility, and then I seem to capture a few individuals that had just notches, and that was something that I was kind of surprised at, and that falls in those non-rehab turtles. And so I really do wonder if there is a larger impact that occurred from some of those turtles that, you know, we may have never captured, being out there in the wild and never having looked at. And because turtles live so long too, like these map turtles, you know, you're talking about a 60, 70-year lifespan, and they're just tanks. They can survive a lot. And so getting that oil off them and getting them back out there and doing their thing, you know, I think helped that population overall, where, you know, looking at that was just monthly survival. You know, if only 84, 85% are surviving from 1 month to the next that had never gone through rehab, you're going to see some serious drastic population declines. And then it takes forever for turtle populations to rebound.
Yeah, and I think some of the key things that Josh presented related to that were that the turtles that were overwintered and released in really good condition, you know, body condition index and things like that, that they had the highest survival, coupled with the fact that time to death within rehab was almost 2 months. So the acute mortality is not the big story here. It's the delayed mortality and the condition and the continued stressors on those turtles.
Joe Ellen speaking.
All right, Mike Cooper.
Josh, I'll just add my comment of what a great job this is. Really a very thorough amount of work, and also some really interesting stuff, as you were just mentioning, about survival after oiling, showing quite a bit of actually resilience over all those years of the oiled population. My question gets back to, and I'm sorry, you had so much data in there I didn't catch. What proportion of the turtles that were collected and rehabbed were eventually translocated? And I couldn't remember that from the beginning of the presentation.
Joshua speaking.
Yeah. So I'm thinking it's about, of the map turtles, I think it was about a third of them were translocated.
So I guess the reason I'm asking, and I'm really curious, this is just such an interesting natural history story here too. You know, it looked like the numbers of individuals that would actually home in and come back, it looked to, I think your numbers were somewhere around 30 to 50%, if that was right?
Yeah, so that's the number of recaptured. So essentially it's 100 out of the 700 total translocated found their way back home. But again, those 230 that we recaptured, some of them might have been 2.5 kilometers away instead of the 2.4, and I didn't include
Sure.
them. And so yes, there's a large number that did.
Because I guess where I'm going with this is the proportion of the population that was lost and demonstrated toward the very end about the the decreased numbers of adult turtles. The portion of the population that never made it home, that didn't get over whatever kind of things were in the way of their ability to home and migrate back to where they started. That migration process, that homing process, may have led inadvertently, of course, but the individuals that didn't make it back could represent a large portion of what was actually lost.
Yeah.
And where I'm going with this is I'm just sort of wondering if, like, say you took a bunch of healthy turtles and put them out into similar conditions, looked at their ability to home in, translocate them, and then look at what control homing rates would end up with, what kind of returns you would get. A portion, just curious if, that previous oiling, one of the things that may have occurred is you may have had increased mortality in the animals that were trying to home in and find their way home. And I only bring this up because in the bird world, when we look at migrating birds, one of the things that we know that contaminants will do is it will decrease migration efficiency. It can affect an animal's health in terms of getting or moving and coming back somewhere. It can also affect an animal's ability to home in on where they need to be going. So, I mean, just if you want to comment at all, or do you think there's any aspect of your population change may have actually had something to do with maybe an increased loss of adults that might have occurred in the translocated populations, subpopulation there?
Yeah, so I had tried to, because it got really confusing, really complicated when you talk about those translocated, and some of them are coming back. So when I did those initial population estimates for that 2010, I wanted to just remove those and not even include those at all, because some do, and there's all these other variables that you don't know what's going on with that population. They could have just stayed put and were still alive out there, and so I didn't want to factor any of those in at all. And so I just looked at those that were released within a kilometer of where they had originally been captured, and just look at the population, that population.
Got it.
Lisa speaking.
So Mike, when you dig into the details, yeah, those were just removed. So that population loss does not include the translocated. And of course, there's an 8-year time gap, and you had some of those turtles being older to start with.
Yeah.
So there's a big black box there on the translocated, but those population reductions are without the translocated being part of the starting population.
Got it. Okay. But I guess thank you. That clarifies the population level. I do find this really interesting. It would be, if maybe we can talk about this separately afterwards or another time, but it'd be interesting to know what other kind of studies have been done with, these kind of numbers of animals, or even close to these kind of numbers, where you're actually looking at homing success in translocated turtles. I don't know if it'd be this species or any other species. It sounds like it's a pretty established behavior. It'd be interesting to see in other studies what kind of success you might anticipate.
Joshua speaking.
Yeah, you don't get the opportunity to move animals 80 kilometers away just to do a study. So I tried to use what I could, because seeing that first one that all of a sudden shows back up, and you're like, oh, this is what we expected, and it's great to see. And then you start getting more and more of them. And so yeah, I would love to put transmitters on turtles and see how quick they do it, and move them at these various distances, and see what the survival is and whatnot.
With that said, at least I think you have established a pretty good benchmark here for other studies and this kind of approach, demonstrating, number one, that it seems to work. You tend to get good survival in the ones that are cleaned up, and it's a management opportunity that seems to be presenting itself for this kind of a situation in the future.
Yeah, thank you.
Joe Ellen speaking.
Thank you.
I want to switch over. There's a couple questions in the chat, and then I see Clark's hand is up. So hopefully we can get to every question before we have to wrap up. But Dave Mosby had commented that reptile eggs are a permeable membrane. Has anyone done tox testing with turtle eggs with oil or other contaminants in sediment for NRDA?
Joshua speaking.
Not that I know of. I know there was something done it was early 2000s where there was a spill in Pennsylvania where they looked at some of the turtles. You know, I think they had 20 turtles. Looked at some that had been oiled, and if there was any deformities in the hatchlings, and they had a number of deformities from those turtles that had been oiled. But the map turtles specifically, they're nesting, you know, a good distance from the river, kind of up out of those areas where the floodplain. And so when we were at the 100-year flood stage, like these turtles are still nesting slightly above that water line.
All right, and then Stephanie had asked, did NRDA settlement money pay for this follow-up work?
I got a chuckle because Stephanie was in Michigan and was integral in managing the trustee council and getting to the settlement. So yes, there was $300,000 in the settlement for turtles. It was before the days of us, you know, systematically combining RIA and HIA approaches, but where a lot of the claims were based on HIA, we recognized that turtle was a special group with lots of uncertainty. So we negotiated for $300,000 for turtles. And as a restoration project, the idea was to track turtles, find where they were nesting up in these higher, drier areas away from the river, and protect them from predation, seeing that as an ongoing limiting factor on their population. So it was a turtle-specific project. I think Stephanie and I and others were plotting from the beginning as to how we could leverage that restoration project to get the most science and information for future NRDAs out of it. And Josh and the group from the University of Toledo combined some additional funding and hit it out of the park. I mean, just totally exceeded my expectations about what this $300,000 could do and could leverage. And so like every chapter of Josh's dissertation and every publication that's coming out of here is just, I'm just so excited, so impressed by it. They really took and ran with that kernel of an idea that we had and that seed money from the NRDA settlement.
Excellent. Clark, if you want to come on, I know we're almost at the top of the hour, but Josh, if you can hang on for this last question.
Oh, for Clark, for sure.
Well, just a follow-up comment related to Betsy Nightingale's question of value. So we have two tribes in the watershed, both participants on the trustee council. And though I can't speak for them, I can give a fair approximation, I think, of what they think of in terms of value and turtles. So turtles are an integral part of their culture. And we actually initiated this project with the Gun Lake tribe coming down to the shores of the Kalamazoo and performing a water ceremony. And I'd let John Eisenhart follow up if he wants to, but unquestionable cultural value in terms of turtles. And so well beyond just conservation value, though as Lisa's absolutely right, Josh certainly hit this one out of the park. But for the tribes, this was particularly
Lisa speaking.
Meaningful to see this kind of effort devoted to a cultural icon of the tribe. So just to follow up on Betsy's question, thanks.
Thanks, Clark.
Joe Ellen speaking.
All right, well, we are past the hour, so we're going to wrap up. Kathy had put in another turtle study. You might want to grab that if you're interested before jumping off of here, because I don't think folks will have access to this chat once you hang up. So once again, Josh, thanks so much for presenting today. This the slides should be up on our website soon, and then hopefully the recording will be whenever ORDA, whenever they get those posted. So thanks again, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks a lot.
Great job, Josh.
Thanks.
Well done.